I'm Claire Hartley, 29 years old, and if you'd told me in my early 20s that I'd be the one sitting at a mahogany table in a county courthouse with my name on a fortune I never asked for, I would have laughed to keep from crying. The room smelled like paper and old carpet cleaner, and the click of a pen in the attorney's hand felt louder than my own heartbeat. Across from me, my parents wore matching smiles that didn't reach their eyes, while my brother lounged as if the chair had been built for him. The window behind the attorney reflected all of us in a flat pane of afternoon light, one family, many versions of truth. I kept my hands folded the way my grandfather taught me when a storm was coming. He always said the first quiet breath decides what you do next. The door eased shut, the room settled, and the rustle of the will began like the first page of a book you can't close. I thought I knew how this chapter would end. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand tall when people expected you to shrink tap-like, and subscribe so this story reaches someone who needs it. I was born into a house where everything had a place, and feelings were asked to keep to themselves. My father, Thomas, judged life by results and appearances, and my mother, Valerie, made social calendars feel like commandments. But my grandfather, Edward, taught me the smaller lessons that stuck. Say, please, say thank you. Show up and finish what you start. I learned early that kindness doesn't cost a penny, and integrity doesn't always win a crowd, and those values felt simple until I understood how easily a family can mistake performance for love. Lucas was groomed to shine under every chandelier, while I was the quiet silhouette at the edge of the room, happier with a library card than a spotlight. Money was never the point. When I was little, I cared more about a steady voice reading me a story at night than the make of the car in the driveway. But in our neighborhood, the shine on the silver mattered, and my parents wore that like armor. My grandfather noticed the gap between what looked perfect and what felt right. He had calluses from the work that built his businesses, and sometimes he'd fix a loose cabinet hinge in my apartment without saying a word about it, as if he were shoring up a life piece by piece. He told me once over Sunday roast that quiet is not the same as weak, and I tucked that away like a spare house key, never imagining how often I'd reach for it. As I grew older, the contrast between what my parents praised and who I was sharpened in ways I could measure. Lucas received a car at 16 and a champagne toast when he got into his dream school, and I received careful warnings about being realistic when I won a short story contest and asked to attend a summer program. We lived in a world where the weekly yard service trimmed the hedges to a perfect line, but dinner could feel like a test. I had already failed, and the distance between us stretched quietly until it wasn't quiet at all. When tension turned into rules delivered like verdicts, I discovered how thin the line is between being overlooked and being pushed aside. You can love your family and still see that they love an image more than the person standing in front of them. Through that long season, my one steady place was the worn leather chair in my grandfather's den, the one that sagged a little on the left. He'd pass me a cup of coffee and let me talk or not talk, and either way, I left feeling like I still had a compass. I didn't know it then, but the map he was drawing for me was meant for days far harder than I could imagine. The day of the will reading carried a kind of quiet. I recognized the way air feels before a summer storm. I arrived early, sat near the end of the polished table, and focused on my breathing, because small, steady things are how you hold your center when other people are performing. My parents entered as if they were hosting a reception, greeting the receptionist by name, commenting on the weather settling into their chairs with the comfort that comes from believing a stage belongs to you. Lucas followed with that same easy swagger I remembered from homecoming nights and holiday dinners. I nodded, kept my tone even, and thought of the last time I'd seen my grandfather, how warm his hand felt when he squeezed mine, how he said, "You'll know what to do when it's time." Stephen Marlowe. The attorney took his seat with the patience of someone who'd seen many families dress their wants up as logic. He clicked his pen once, scanned the document, and looked up. The second his eyes met mine, the room felt smaller, my past felt closer, and I understood that whatever came next would ask me to remember exactly who taught me how to breathe through a storm. He cleared his throat and began to read. The air inside the courthouse felt heavy that morning, the kind of quiet that makes every shuffle and sigh echo off the walls. Stephen's voice carried softly across the table as he began reading my grandfather's will, his words clipped and deliberate. My mother tilted her head with the practiced poise of someone waiting for applause, and my father adjusted his cufflinks like a man preparing to claim what he already believed was his. Lucas leaned back, half smiling, his hand resting casually on the folder in front of him. I folded mine in my lap and focused on the slow tick of the clock behind Stephen's chair. Stephen paused briefly before continuing, his tone steady. I, Edward Hartley, being of sound mind, hereby leave the entirety of my estate. My mother exhaled a small sigh of victory. Valued at approximately $5 billion, he continued to my granddaughter, Claire Hartley. For a heartbeat, no one moved. My father's smile froze. My mother's hand slipped from her pearl necklace, and Lucas blinked as if the words had rearranged themselves in the air. The silence that followed felt like it had weight. I don't know how long I sat there before I realized everyone was staring at me. My father cleared his throat first, the sound sharp in the stillness. That's generous, he said slowly. But of course, the estate will need proper management. She's young. She'll need guidance. My mother found her voice next syrupy sweet and trembling at the edges. Naturally, dear, you'll want help with all of this, she said, turning toward me. Your father and I can handle the logistics. You shouldn't burden yourself. Stephen didn't even look up from the document. Mr. Hartley's instructions are clear, he said evenly. There are no trustees, no shared management. The assets are to remain in Ms. Hartley's name and control alone. My mother blinked, then forced a smile so tight it looked painful. Well, of course, she murmured, her tone softening to something almost maternal. We'll just advise her, that's all. My father nodded, his jaw tight, while Lucas let out a short, humorless laugh. Claire, Lucas said, leaning forward. This is huge. You can't even begin to understand what's involved in handling something like this. It's not a checking account, it's an empire. You'll drown if you try to do it alone. His words landed with a familiar sting, the same tone he'd used years ago when he told me I wasn't cut out for the big stuff. I met his eyes and said nothing. Stephen continued outlining the legal clauses, but I hardly heard him. The moment felt unreal. My grandfather had left everything to me. I thought of his quiet patience, his gentle humor, the way he'd sit beside me at the kitchen table and let me talk without interrupting. He must have known this would happen, that they'd try to take control before the ink was even dry. After the papers were signed and the meeting concluded, my parents gathered their things with stiff, mechanical movements. My mother pressed a hand to my shoulder, her voice lowered. Sweetheart, let's meet tomorrow to go over next steps. Your father already has a team in mind. Lawyers, accountants, people you can trust. I didn't answer. She squeezed harder. We're your family, she added, the edge in her tone barely disguised. You can't do this without us. When I stepped outside, the sunlight felt strange, too bright after the dim courtroom. My phone buzzed in my hand before I reached the car, a text from my mother. Call us tonight. It's important. Another followed seconds later from my father. Don't make any rash moves. We'll handle this. I silenced the screen and drove home without replying. By evening, the messages piled up, missed calls, voicemails filled with concern that didn't sound like concern at all. I turned the phone face down on the table and let the house stay quiet. I had thought walking away from them years ago had been the hardest thing I'd ever done. I was wrong. The next morning brought another surprise. A knock rattled the front door before sunrise, firm and familiar. I opened it to find Lucas standing there, a polished smile on his face and a cup of coffee in his hand. Figured you'd need this, he said, stepping past me without waiting for an invitation. His gaze swept across my small living room, lingering on the second-hand furniture and framed sketches on the wall. Nice place, he said with a hint of amusement. You know, with what you've got now, you could do so much better. I leaned against the doorframe. What do you want, Lucas? He set the coffee down and turned toward me, his tone softening. I want to help. Dad's got decades of experience managing large accounts. Mom knows everyone who matters, and I've got the drive to take this thing further. Together, we could make the Hartley name mean something again. It already does, I said quietly. His smile faltered. You're being naive, he said, shaking his head. This isn't about pride, Claire. It's about protecting what's ours. You think Grandpa meant for you to shoulder this alone? Be smart. Let us handle it. I opened the door wider and waited. After a few seconds, he realized I wasn't going to argue. You're making a mistake, he muttered, brushing past me on his way out. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the faint smell of his cologne and the echo of his words. Later that day, my mother arrived unannounced. She swept into the house like she'd never stopped having the right to do so, her perfume lingering in the air before her voice even reached me. Darling, she began, her tone rich with practiced warmth. We need to talk about this. You've always been emotional, and money can be dangerous when you're not careful. I stood near the window, hands folded the same way I had in that courtroom. The estate is mine, Mom. Grandpa made that clear. Her expression hardened for a moment before she smiled again, smoother this time. He trusted you. Yes, she said, but he'd want us all to share the responsibility. You don't want the public thinking you're selfish. Family means balance. There it was again, that word family used like a leash. I didn't respond. She reached out and touched my arm lightly. Claire, listen to me. Let your father manage the accounts, and you can focus on the things you enjoy. It'll be easier for everyone. I'm fine, I said. She sighed, straightened her jacket, and looked around the room one last time. You'll call when you've come to your senses, she said before walking out the door. Her heels clicked down the front steps, the sound sharp and even like punctuation. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went dark. The phone glowed with new messages I didn't bother to read. The quiet hummed in my ears, steady and alive, and I thought of my grandfather's hand on mine the last time we spoke. He'd told me I was stronger than I realized. At the time, I thought he was just trying to comfort me. Now I wondered if he'd been warning me instead. I gathered the documents Stephen had given me, laid them out neatly, and stared at the name printed at the bottom of each page, Claire E. Hartley, sole heir and executor. It looked unreal in the lamplight, but it was mine. For the first time, I understood what that truly meant. Not just the money, but the burden of keeping it safe from the very people who had never wanted me to have it. Outside, the wind shifted against the windows, gentle at first, then stronger, tapping like a reminder. I knew it wasn't over. My family had lost the first battle, but they wouldn't let the war end there. I turned off the light, locked the door, and whispered the words I hadn't said aloud in years, I'm ready this time. And somewhere in the distance, I imagined my grandfather's calm voice saying what he always did before I faced a storm, then stand tall, Claire, and don't move an inch. The week after the will reading blurred into restless nights and half-finished meals. I tried to focus on small things, laundry paperwork, anything that kept my mind from replaying that moment in the courtroom. My parents' stunned faces still lingered in every quiet space, and I half expected one of them to show up again at any moment. By the third night, I'd started leaving the porch light off, hoping that darkness might keep them away. It didn't. A call came late one afternoon from Stephen Marlowe. His tone was formal, clipped, and something in it made my stomach tighten. Miss Hartley, he said I need to confirm something. Did you authorize anyone to access the estate accounts? I told him no, confused. He sighed softly, the sound of papers rustling faintly in the background. Someone presented themselves at the bank as your representative this morning. They tried to withdraw funds. The words hung in the air. I gripped the edge of the counter, waiting for the rest. The attempt was flagged and denied, he continued. Your grandfather's stipulations prevented it, but they were insistent. You should be aware. I didn't need him to tell me who it was. I could already see the scene in my mind, my father's authority, my mother's charm, and Lucas standing just behind them, certain the rules didn't apply. That evening I drove past their house without meaning to. The porch light still glowed like it had my entire childhood, the front walk lined with the same trimmed hedges. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of my mother's silhouette, moving across the living room, phone pressed to her ear. 2 cars in the driveway, dinner, likely on the stove. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. I sat there for a long minute, engine running, realizing how different home looked once you'd been pushed out of it. The next morning, the whispers began. It started at the grocery store, a small town chorus of half-heard remarks. The cashier, who had always been friendly, avoided my eyes. A woman behind me whispered something to her friend, the word inheritance catching my ear. At first I brushed it off, but by the end of the week it was everywhere, side glances at the gas station, quiet conversations that stopped when I walked by. I overheard enough to understand the story my parents had spun. They said the money had been meant for Lucas, that I'd somehow manipulated our grandfather while he was ill. They said I wasn't equipped to handle a fortune that large, that I was unstable and easily influenced. In a town that thrived on reputation, those words spread fast. Even the few friends I had left began to pull away. Calls went unanswered, messages trailed off. Invitations that once came weekly disappeared altogether. I found myself eating dinners alone in silence, the sound of the refrigerator filling the gaps where laughter used to be. It was one thing to lose family by choice. It was another to be quietly erased from a place you'd tried to rebuild in. One night, I sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd signed the inheritance papers just weeks before. The table felt too big, the house too quiet. I opened a drawer to find an old envelope tucked between receipts. My name was written in my grandfather's familiar script. For a moment, I just stared at it, afraid of what might be inside. It was postmarked 6 years earlier from my 21st birthday. He'd handed it to me then, saying only, "You'll know when to open it." I hadn't thought about it since. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a single page of lined stationery, the ink slightly faded. His handwriting was neat, steady. "Claire," it began, "if you're reading this, I trust you've learned by now that the world doesn't give, it takes. Don't let it take your peace. You are stronger than you believe, and there will come a time when you'll need to stand taller than feels comfortable. When that happens, don't shrink. They can only take from you if you hand it to them." I read the words 3 times before the meaning settled in. He had known. He had seen the cracks in our family long before I did. The letter felt like a map drawn for this exact moment. I folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope, tracing his name with my thumb. The ache in my chest shifted into something steadier, heavier, but sure. From that night forward, I kept notes of every call, every message, every attempt they made to reach me. I learned to save voicemail recordings and screenshot texts, documenting every thread of manipulation, like I was building a quiet defense. The fear that had shadowed me for years began to fade under the weight of a new kind of purpose. A few days later, a message arrived that was different from the rest. It was from my father, short and cold. "We're filing for guardianship of the estate. You'll thank us later." I stared at the words until they blurred a sharp reminder that the quiet war had only just begun. Still, I didn't call anyone. Instead, I took the letter from my grandfather and set it beside the document naming me sole heir. The contrast between the two felt like the story of my life, the man who believed in me and the family who refused to. The next morning, I brewed coffee and sat by the window as the first light filled the room. The street outside was still, and the world looked almost calm, but I knew better. My parents wouldn't stop. They'd lost too much control to walk away now. As I looked down at the letter one last time, I whispered the words softly to myself, letting them take root. "Don't shrink. Stand tall." That line followed me into every hour that came after. It steadied my breathing, anchored my thoughts, and reminded me that survival wasn't enough anymore. The time for quiet endurance had passed. The next time they came for what wasn't theirs, I would be ready. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the glass like a soft warning. I closed the curtains, locked the door, and turned off my phone. The house sank into silence again, but this time it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like preparation. By the end of the week, the town's gossip had grown louder, but so had my resolve. Every whisper was proof that my grandfather had been right to trust me over them. I didn't need to fight back with anger or noise. I would fight back with proof, with patience, and with the kind of calm they couldn't understand. I placed the letter in a folder, sealed it, and stored it with the legal documents in a small, fireproof box. It wasn't much, but it was something solid in a world that had turned slippery with lies. When the night came and the house fell quiet again, I sat in the dim light of the living room, watching the reflection of my own face in the window. I didn't look afraid anymore. I looked ready. and somewhere deep down, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again, steady and sure as ever, reminding me that storms aren't meant to be avoided. They're meant to be faced head-on. That thought stayed with me as I turned out the lights, because the storm was coming. And this time, I wouldn't be caught off guard. The days after I found my grandfather's letter felt different. I woke up earlier not because I slept well, but because there was something steady in me again, something that hadn't been there in years. His words echoed through every quiet corner of the house. Don't shrink. Stand tall. It wasn't a pep talk, it was instruction. I didn't see it as defiance, just clarity. I started keeping my phone on silent and made a list of what I could control, small, practical steps that helped me breathe when everything else felt uncertain. The first step was money. I didn't want to rely on anyone from my grandfather's old circle, not the executives who still sent polite condolences, or the acquaintances who used to smile too wide at family gatherings. Through a coworker, I was introduced to Arthur Hale, a financial advisor who worked quietly out of a small office near downtown. His handshake was firm, his voice calm, and there was nothing flashy about him, just a notepad filled with tidy handwriting and a patient way of listening. He didn't talk numbers right away. He asked questions instead, what I wanted to do with the estate, what kind of life I pictured 5 years from now, what scared me the most about inheriting it. When I finally admitted that I was terrified of being manipulated again, he nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. You don't have to know everything right now, he said, sliding a simple plan across the desk. You just have to take the next right step. I walked out of his office that day with a folder full of paperwork and something lighter in my chest. The plan was cautious: secure accounts, limited access, careful investments. For the first time, I felt like the money wasn't a trap. It was a foundation. A few weeks later, I bought a small house on the edge of town. Nothing extravagant, 2 bedrooms, a worn oak floor, a porch that creaked under its own weight, but it was mine. When I held the keys for the first time, I stood in the doorway and listened to the stillness. No one could tell me to leave. No one could decide my worth here. As the weeks passed, I began stepping back into the world I'd been hiding from. My grandfather had supported a local charity board years ago, and when they reached out asking if I'd attend a meeting in his honor, I agreed. I almost turned back twice on the drive over, nervous about the whispers that still followed me in town. But when I arrived, the board members greeted me kindly, some out of respect for him, others with quiet curiosity about me. The meetings were held in a modest brick building that smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish. I sat at the long table listening more than I spoke, learning how things worked. At first, I could feel the weight of people's eyes, the subtle hesitation when my name came up, but after a few weeks of steady attendance and small contributions, the air shifted. They stopped seeing me as the headline in someone else's gossip and started seeing me as a person who showed up prepared and sincere. It was during one of those meetings that I met Benjamin Cross. He was a retired attorney, silver-haired, with a deliberate way of speaking, the kind of man who made you listen without trying to command a room. When he learned my name, his expression softened. "Edward's granddaughter," he said quietly. "He spoke of you often." After the meeting, he invited me for coffee at a small cafe across the street. He told me stories about my grandfather, how he used to stay late after board sessions to fix small problems no one else noticed, like a loose railing or a jammed window. He believed in preparation, Benjamin said, stirring his cup. He believed in protecting what mattered before anyone realized it needed protection. Something in his tone made me lean in. "What do you mean?" He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin, weathered folder. "Your grandfather anticipated this," he said simply. "The tension, the interference, all of it. He came to me about a year before he passed." I felt my pulse quicken. Inside the folder were documents neatly notarized and signed. Benjamin explained that Edward had built legal safeguards into his estate clauses that disinherited anyone who attempted to undermine or misrepresent his wishes. If my parents or brother tried to present themselves as my guardians or representatives, they would forfeit all rights to future benefits. It wasn't just sentiment, it was strategy. I sat there for a long time, running my hand over the embossed seal at the bottom of one page. My grandfather hadn't only trusted me to inherit what he built, he'd built a wall around me to keep his trust intact. Benjamin watched my face carefully. He wanted you to know that he saw what was coming, he said. He wanted you to feel secure, not scared. The words landed quietly but deeply. For months, I had been trying to brace myself for the next move from my parents, convinced that every new call or letter would bring another ambush. But now, for the first time, I realized I wasn't as vulnerable as they thought. When I left the cafe, the sky had darkened, a faint drizzle tapping against the sidewalk. I didn't rush to the car. I walked slowly, letting the rain cool my skin, thinking of my grandfather sitting across a desk from Benjamin years ago, planning for a day like this. The foresight felt like a message left behind in plain sight. That night I spread the documents across my dining table beside the letter he'd written years before. The two pieces of paper looked ordinary ink and signatures words on a page, but together they told a story. He hadn't just wanted to protect his money, he'd wanted to protect me. The next morning I met Arthur again to review everything. He read the clauses carefully, his expression measured. "Your grandfather was thorough," he said finally. "Anyone who tries to interfere now risks exposing themselves legally." "You're standing on solid ground, Claire." For the first time in months, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The weight that had pressed on my chest since the day of the will reading began to lift. My parents could circle all they wanted, but I wasn't the same person they had cast out years ago. Arthur folded the papers, neatly tucking them back into the folder. "They'll test you again," he said. "That kind of control doesn't let go easily. But remember, you don't have to fight loud. Just keep your record straight and your steps steady." I nodded. His advice reminded me of something my grandfather once said after a storm knocked down half the trees in his yard. Strength isn't about never bending. It's about standing back up when the wind stops. That evening, I sat on the porch of my new house, watching the light fade over the fields behind it. The sound of rain lingered on the air, and for once it didn't feel heavy. I thought about everything my grandfather had done, the letter, the protections, the faith he had placed in me, and I felt something close to peace. But beneath that peace was a quiet awareness. My parents had tried charm guilt and manipulation, and none of it had worked. The next step wouldn't be quiet. I knew them well enough to recognize that when subtlety failed, they always turned to force. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the distant roll of thunder somewhere beyond the hills. The storm hadn't passed. It was gathering again, and this time I would be ready to meet it. The morning after meeting with Arthur, I woke before dawn to the sound of rain brushing softly against the windows. The world outside felt washed clean, and for a moment I let myself breathe in the quiet. I made coffee and watched the steam rise, thinking about how calm the house felt compared to the one I'd grown up in. This small space was nothing like my parents' world of marble floors and showpiece furniture. It was simple and steady, built for living, not performance. In the days that followed, I settled into a new rhythm. I met with Arthur twice a week, keeping track of every account, every document, and every transaction. We went through each clause of my grandfather's estate until I understood every detail, and with each meeting my confidence grew. The anxiety that had once kept me on edge began to fade, replaced by quiet resolve. Still, I knew my family wouldn't stay silent forever. The lull was too long, too calm. My parents were people who thrived on control, and silence wasn't their way of surrender. It was strategy. Their first move came through my mother. She called one afternoon, her voice sweet and polished, as if nothing had happened. "Claire, darling," she began, "your father and I have been talking. We think it's time you let us help you manage the estate. It's too much for one person. People are beginning to talk." I could hear the faint sound of a wine glass setting down on a counter. "Mom," I said evenly, "we've already discussed this. The estate isn't yours to manage." Her tone sharpened. "It's our family's legacy. Your grandfather built it for all of us. Surely you understand that." "I understand what he wanted," I replied. He made it very clear. There was a pause long enough to feel heavy. "You've always been so ungrateful," she said softly, almost as if she pitied me. "I hope you're not letting outsiders fill your head with foolish ideas." I didn't respond. She sighed, muttered something about family loyalty, and hung up before I could answer. For a few days after that call, I went about my life in relative peace. I poured my energy into the charity board, volunteering more hours and helping organize a small fundraiser in my grandfather's name. The work felt good, purposeful. People had started to treat me with genuine respect, not because of the inheritance, but because I showed up and followed through. It reminded me of him, the quiet way he led, never asking for attention, but always earning it. Then, on a Friday evening, the storm I'd been expecting arrived. Arthur called just after dinner, his tone more serious than usual. "Claire," he said, "I thought you should hear this from me before it reaches you another way. Your parents and brother filed a petition with the county court this afternoon." I set my fork down slowly. "What kind of petition? They're requesting guardianship over the estate," he said. "They're claiming you're unfit to manage it." The room felt smaller. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the kitchen and the hum of the refrigerator, every sound too loud. "They can't do that," I said finally. "They can try," he replied. "But remember what Benjamin showed you, the protections your grandfather put in place. Those documents will make their claim difficult to support. We'll meet first thing Monday to prepare your response." When I hung up, the air around me felt different. The peace of the last few weeks vanished, replaced by the sharp edge of familiar betrayal. They hadn't stopped trying to take what wasn't theirs. They'd just found a new way to disguise it. That weekend stretched endlessly. Every time the phone rang, I jumped, expecting another blow. I barely slept, spending long hours rereading my grandfather's letter and the legal documents he'd left behind. By Sunday night, exhaustion finally pushed me into sleep, though it was restless and shallow. Monday morning arrived gray and cold. I dressed carefully, navy suit, simple jewelry, hair pinned back. The courthouse felt too familiar, its polished floors reflecting the same kind of false calm that filled my parents' home. I found Arthur waiting for me outside the courtroom doors, steady as always. "They'll make a scene," he warned quietly. "Let them. Just stay calm." Inside, my parents and Lucas sat together at one table, perfectly coordinated in muted colors, their lawyer standing just ahead of them. My mother offered a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. My father gave a curt nod. Lucas smirked like it was a private joke between us. When the hearing began, their attorney stood and spoke with theatrical sincerity. "Your Honor." My clients are deeply concerned for their daughter. She has no prior experience managing large-scale assets and no history of financial independence. The estate left to her is extensive, complex, and potentially overwhelming. They seek only to protect both her and her grandfather's legacy. Every word was deliberate, each one painted with false care. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. My father folded his hands like a man carrying the weight of duty, and Lucas stared straight ahead, wearing that same smug confidence he'd had the day of the will reading. Then Arthur rose. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about concern, it's about control." He laid out the documents Benjamin had given us, each notarized clause my grandfather had signed. He showed the letters from my parents urging me to hand over authority, the text messages where they mocked my ability to manage anything on my own. Finally, he presented the failed attempt at the bank. The courtroom grew silent. My parents' lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Arthur's voice stayed calm as he read one final excerpt from my grandfather's notes. "If they attempt to take what is not theirs, it will prove why I chose her." When he finished, even the judge sat still for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked toward my parents' table. "This petition is denied," she said firmly. "The estate remains in Ms. Hartley's control. Any further interference will be considered a violation of the deceased's documented intent. I suggest you take this outcome seriously." The sound of her gavel echoed through the chamber like a door closing. My mother turned toward me, her smile brittle. "We were only trying to protect you," she whispered. My father's face had gone pale, the mask of control slipping at the edges. Lucas muttered something under his breath and walked out before anyone could stop him. When the judge left the bench, I stayed seated for a moment, my hands resting on the table. The air felt lighter. Arthur touched my shoulder briefly. "You handled yourself well," he said quietly. As I stepped outside, the sunlight broke through the clouds, warm against my skin. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to look over my shoulder. My parents had lost more than a court case, they'd lost the power they'd always held over me. Still, I knew better than to think it was over. Their pride wouldn't let them walk away quietly. The damage to their reputation, their finances, their standing in the community, it would sting. And when people like them are cornered, they find new ways to fight. I stood on the courthouse steps watching the last of the storm clouds fade and thought of my grandfather's words once more. They can only take from you if you hand it to them. I wasn't handing them anything ever again. As Arthur and I walked to the car, the wind picked up, scattering a few leaves across the pavement. "This chapter's done," he said gently. "But the fallout's coming. Be ready for it." I nodded, knowing he was right. What had just ended inside the courthouse was only the beginning of something larger. Justice had been served, but the reckoning, the slow unraveling that always follows truth, was still on its way. When I left the courthouse that day, the air felt lighter than it had in months. I could still hear the echo of the gavel in my head, sharp and final. The petition was denied, and for the first time my parents' power over me had been stripped away where it mattered most. But as Arthur had warned, victories like this never come without fallout. The next few weeks unfolded quietly at first. I kept to my routine morning walks, meetings with the charity board, regular updates with Arthur. I didn't go looking for trouble, but whispers have a way of finding you when people need someone to blame. I began noticing small changes around town. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street. Old friends kept conversations short. It wasn't hard to guess where the stories came from. One afternoon, while shopping for groceries, I overheard two women by the produce section. They spoke just loud enough for me to catch fragments. Her own parents, one said, shaking her head. "Imagine humiliating them like that." The other clucked her tongue. "Poor things. They only wanted to help her." I set my basket down and walked away without saying a word. I didn't need to defend myself to strangers. The truth was out there, sealed in court documents and testimony. But small towns don't run on truth, they run on stories, and my parents were experts at telling theirs. Arthur called one evening to check in. "You holding up?" he asked. I told him I was fine, but he paused, unconvinced. "They'll burn through every bit of influence they have trying to rewrite this. Don't engage. Let time do what time does." His voice carried the steady patience of someone who had seen this kind of storm before. He was right. Within a month, I began to see cracks forming in the image my parents had worked so hard to maintain. My mother's social circle, the same women who once treated her like royalty, started to distance themselves. A friend from the board mentioned that several people had withdrawn their invitations to her charity events. Rumors about the court case had spread beyond town. The details weren't hard to verify, and the public sympathy she had carefully cultivated began to crumble. My father fared no better. Word traveled quickly through his company. A few clients quietly pulled their accounts, unwilling to be associated with scandal. Meetings were canceled. Then came the inevitable announcement he was taking early retirement. I learned later that the decision hadn't been voluntary. For a man whose identity was built on control and success, that loss must have cut deep. As for Lucas, his fall was faster and louder. The texts Arthur had presented in court, mocking arrogant, impossible to deny, had made their way into the local paper's coverage of the hearing. Overnight, his reputation as the charming golden son vanished. The friends who once followed him everywhere stopped answering his calls. His girlfriend left him, and within a few weeks he moved back into my parents' house. I imagined the three of them there. 3 people bound not by love, but by shared resentment, each blaming the others for the ruin of their good name. While their world shrank, mine grew in ways I hadn't expected. The charity board expanded its work, and I was asked to chair a new initiative focused on community scholarships. It was a project close to my heart, something my grandfather would have been proud of. For the first time, people began to approach me without hesitation, not out of curiosity or pity, but respect. I didn't need to defend who I was anymore. My actions spoke louder than their gossip ever could. At home, I found a new kind of peace in the small routines that filled my days. I tended to the garden out back, something I'd started after moving in, but never had time to nurture. Watching things grow slowly, quietly on their own schedule felt grounding. On weekends, I'd sit on the porch with a book and a cup of coffee, the late afternoon light stretching long over the yard. It wasn't the kind of life I had imagined for myself years ago, but it felt honest. It felt earned. Still, every so often a memory would surface. My mother's smile the night she told me to pack my things at 18, my father's voice calling me a disappointment, Lucas's smirk across the dinner table. They were ghosts now, tied to a version of me that no longer existed. But ghosts don't vanish overnight. They fade slowly until the memory stops hurting. One evening I took a drive past my parents' house. The neighborhood looked the same: neat lawns, trimmed hedges, but the house itself seemed smaller somehow. The shutters needed paint, and the porch light flickered unevenly. I parked across the street and watched as dusk settled around it. Through the front window I saw movement shadows passing the faint glow of a television. Once that house had been a symbol of everything I wasn't allowed to be a part of. Now it just looked tired. I sat there for a while, remembering the night I'd left it for good. I had stood in that doorway with nothing but a backpack and a few dollars, believing I would never survive on my own. I smiled at the thought of that girl, scared, unsteady, but stubborn enough to keep going. I wished she could see this moment. When I finally started the car, I didn't feel anger or triumph, just a quiet certainty that some doors are meant to close for good. The road ahead was empty and open, the kind that stretches straight into the horizon. Back home, I walked through the quiet rooms, turning off lights one by one. The house smelled faintly of rain and lavender from the candle on the counter. I paused at the dining table, where my grandfather's letter still rested in its envelope, tucked neatly between a book and a stack of papers. I hadn't read it in weeks, but I didn't need to. The words had settled into me long ago. "Don't shrink. Stand tall." I whispered the line aloud just to hear it again. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. I thought of all the ways my grandfather had prepared me without ever saying exactly how. He hadn't just given me an inheritance, he had given me the strength to stand alone in rooms where I once felt small. As I closed the window, my phone buzzed with a message from Arthur. "Heard from the courthouse today, case officially sealed. You're clear of them, Claire." I smiled, typing back a simple thank you. The story that had once defined me, unwanted daughter, outcast heir, was finally losing its grip. There would still be whispers, always a few people who preferred fiction over fact, but they no longer mattered. I had my peace, and they had their silence. Before heading to bed, I stepped out onto the porch one last time. The night was cool, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed faintly, a sound I'd always loved for its mix of loneliness and promise. I leaned against the railing and watched the lights of town shimmer faintly below the hill. Tomorrow there would be more work to do. Meetings, plans, the slow building of a life that belonged entirely to me. But tonight I let the quiet hold me. I wasn't running anymore, and I wasn't hiding. The war my family had started was over, but the peace that followed would take time to grow roots. And I intended to tend it carefully, the way my grandfather had once tended his own legacy, with patient steadiness and an unshakable belief that storms don't last forever. As the wind softened and the stars came out, I whispered one last thank you to him, to the life I'd built, and to the woman I'd finally become. The fight was behind me now. What came next would be mine alone. The months after the court ruling passed in a strange stillness. My parents no longer called, and the quiet was both relief and reminder. For so long I had defined myself in reaction to their disapproval, their demands, their constant presence in every shadow of my life. Now they had nothing left to take, and I had nothing left to lose. Word of the verdict spread farther than I expected. For weeks, people I barely knew stopped me in town to offer polite smiles or hushed congratulations. Some looked apologetic, as if realizing too late that they had believed the wrong story. Others just wanted a closer look at the woman who had stood up to her family in court. I never stayed long in those conversations. The truth didn't need explaining anymore. Arthur checked in every few days, making sure the estate was secure and the accounts untouched. He had a way of grounding everything, reminding me that stability comes from consistency, not from noise. "Let them handle their own chaos," he said one afternoon as we reviewed paperwork in his office. "Your grandfather's plan worked exactly as he hoped." He was right. The fallout had already begun. My mother's friends from the country club had quietly stopped including her in their social circles. The charity committees she once dominated now held meetings without her. My father's forced retirement became the subject of quiet office gossip. People who once admired their elegance now whispered about deception, about greed. Even Lucas's once flawless reputation cracked under the weight of exposure. The texts read aloud in court had made their way online attached to news coverage of the case. The image of the charming, promising son collapsed overnight. By the time winter came, he'd all but disappeared from social media, and word spread that he was back living at home. Meanwhile, my life grew fuller. The scholarship program we'd started through the charity board expanded faster than expected. Applications poured in, and the board voted to name it after my grandfather. Standing behind the podium at the launch event, I looked out at a room full of people who had known him, workers from his factories, local families. He'd quietly helped young students he'd mentored. For the first time, I understood what legacy really meant. It wasn't money or buildings or even a name. It was the way a single act of kindness could outlive the person who gave it. After the event, Benjamin approached me with a smile. He'd be proud, he said. He always believed this would be your strength, the ability to build without bitterness. His words stayed with me for days. There had been a time when I thought victory meant proving my family wrong. But now I saw it differently. The real victory was moving beyond the need for their approval entirely. Still reminders of the past had a way of finding me. One chilly evening, a letter arrived in my mailbox, addressed in my mother's neat handwriting. It was short, barely half a page, but the message was familiar. She spoke of how hard things had been since the court case, how much damage I had done to the family's reputation, how a true daughter would have handled things privately. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done, only guilt disguised as grace. I folded the letter and slipped it into the same drawer that held my grandfather's. They belonged together, two voices, two choices, one rooted in love and belief, the other in control and denial. I didn't need to reply. Silence, I'd learned, can speak clearly enough. The next week, the first heavy snow of the season fell. I was driving home from the office when I passed the old neighborhood where I grew up. On impulse, I turned down the familiar street. The houses looked smaller now, their carefully manicured lawns buried under soft drifts of white. When I reached my parents' house, I parked across the street again just as I had months earlier. The porch light flickered weakly, the shutters warned the paint dull against the snow. Through the frosted front window, I could make out 3 figures sitting in the living room. My father stared at the television, shoulders hunched. My mother sat beside him, her posture rigid even now. Lucas leaned against the wall, phone in hand, eyes down. For a moment, I saw the same tableau from my childhood, perfect on the outside hollow underneath. But something had shifted. The control they once held over everything around them was gone, replaced by a kind of tired stillness. I sat there for a while, engine idling, the heater humming softly. There was no anger left in me, just understanding. Every choice they'd made had built this moment brick by brick, and every time they'd tried to break me down, my grandfather had been quietly building me back up. When I finally drove away, the snow kept falling soft and endless. By the time I reached home, the world outside was blanketed in white. I left the porch light on and stood for a moment under the awning, watching the flakes drift through the beam of light. It was the kind of quiet my grandfather used to love, the kind that holds space for reflection, not regret. Inside, I lit a fire and made tea, the scent of cedar and smoke filling the room. On the mantel sat a framed photo of my grandfather, from years ago, smiling in the garden behind his house, sleeves rolled up, hands still dirty from the soil. It had been taken on a summer afternoon when I was 12. I remembered how he'd told me then, "What you plant with care will always outlast what's built on pride." I hadn't understood it then, but I did now. That night, I wrote a letter of my own, not to my parents, not to anyone living, but to him. I thanked him for believing in me when no one else did, for seeing past the noise, for giving me the tools to build something lasting. I told him that I was learning still how to live in peace, without shrinking, how to stand tall, without standing alone. When I finished, I didn't seal it. I folded it once and set it beside his picture on the mantel. It wasn't meant to be sent. It was meant to be kept a quiet promise that I was still listening. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm light across the room. I thought of how far I'd come from the girl who left home with a backpack to the woman sitting in her own house, unafraid of silence. The past had burned itself out, leaving room for something steadier to grow. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything evenly. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to look back. Whatever came next, whatever peace or distance or unexpected reconciliation might follow, would come in its own time. I reached for the light switch, ready to call it a night. As the room dimmed, the glow from the fireplace danced across the photograph, and I could almost imagine his voice again, calm and sure as ever. "Stand tall, Claire. The rest will take care of itself." And with that thought, I let the quiet fill the room, certain that this chapter at last was closing exactly the way it was meant to. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if the world itself needed time to thaw. The snow melted into narrow streams along the curbs, and the fields beyond my house turned soft and green again. I spent mornings on the porch with coffee, watching robins hop through the yard and listening to the steady rhythm of renewal. The world kept moving forward, and for once, I felt like I was moving with it. In the months after the hearing, life had found its shape again. The noise around the inheritance faded, replaced by work that actually mattered. The scholarship fund in my grandfather's name had begun its first round of awards. Students wrote letters about their plans, their hopes, the way a chance like this might change their lives. Each one reminded me why my grandfather built what he did not for power or pride, but for possibility. Arthur handled most of the administrative work, now freeing me to focus on the human side of things. He often joked that I'd turned my grandfather's empire into something entirely different, a living legacy instead of a monument. I liked that. It felt right. Every so often, Benjamin would stop by my office bringing news from the old board or stories about the early days when he and my grandfather built their first community projects together. We'd talk over lunch, and before he left, he'd always say the same thing. He'd be proud of you, Claire. You did what he couldn't in his lifetime. You broke the cycle. I never knew how to answer that, but the words stayed with me. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself driving out to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. The road was lined with budding trees, their branches reaching toward the light. I hadn't been there in a while, not since the legal battle ended. The sky was bright, the kind of blue that makes you think of second chances. I parked by the gate and walked to his headstone, carrying a small bouquet of white lilies. The stone was simple, just his name, and a short line he'd chosen himself. Integrity builds what time cannot erase. I knelt beside it, brushing away a few leaves, and smiled. "You were right, Grandpa," I said quietly. It wasn't about the money. It never was. Standing there, I thought about everything that had happened the night my parents threw me out, the years of scraping by the courtroom where everything shifted. For so long, I'd believed justice meant seeing them pay for what they did. But true justice, I realized, was learning to live without needing their apology. It was standing on my own, surrounded by peace they couldn't touch. Before leaving, I left the lilies at the base of the stone and whispered the words he'd written to me years ago. "Don't shrink. Stand tall." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of new grass, and I felt something unexplainable like gratitude, steady and full. Back home, I spent the evening working through letters from scholarship applicants. One was from a young woman named Erin, a single mother studying nursing at the community college. She wrote about how her son sat beside her each night as she studied, whispering the vocabulary words out loud to help her memorize them. "He says when he grows up, he wants to help people too," she wrote. I folded the letter carefully, knowing it would be the first one I approved for the next round of funding. Later that night, I sat by the window with the lights off, looking out over the quiet street. The house across the way had its porch light on, casting a warm glow over the steps. I thought about how different my life felt now, no longer ruled by fear or resentment, but by choice. Every day I got to decide what to keep, what to let go of, and what to build. I hadn't spoken to my parents or Lucas since the court ruling, though once in a while I heard bits of news. My father kept to himself, rarely seen in town. My mother had joined a smaller social group, her days of hosting charity galas long over. Lucas had found work managing a small dealership a few towns away. They weren't ruined. They were simply living without the power they once wielded. That was enough. Sometimes forgiveness isn't something you give with words. It's the quiet decision to stop carrying the weight of someone else's choices. That's what I gave them, a release they'd never ask for, and one I no longer needed to announce. As spring deepened, the world felt lighter. The trees outside my window bloomed with soft pink blossoms, and the evening stretched longer, full of that golden light that lingers just before dusk. I spent more time outdoors, walking the path behind the house, breathing in the smell of fresh soil and new life. I realized then that my grandfather's legacy wasn't just about wealth or justice. It was about the simple courage to live differently, to build a life defined by steadiness instead of status, kindness instead of competition. Looking back, every hardship had been a kind of preparation. The rejection, the loneliness, the long climb out of doubt, all of it had shaped me into the kind of person my grandfather must have known I could become. And though part of me still missed the family I'd wished for, I had finally made peace with the one I got. Before turning in that night, I walked through each room of the house, turning off lights as I went. In the quiet, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again, steady, patient, the same way he used to sound when he'd fix something broken without ever complaining. He'd say, "The things you build with care, Claire, they last." And maybe that was the real lesson all along, that even in the face of betrayal, even after losing so much, what we build with integrity outlasts the pain that made us start. So if you're listening now, wherever you are, I hope you remember this. Sometimes justice doesn't come as a courtroom victory or a public reckoning. Sometimes it's found in peace, in knowing you've built something honest after walking through what tried to break you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to stand tall, to choose peace, and to begin again.